Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of Free Thought Hour. Now, tonight I have two South Africans on the show. We have our usual co-host, Tercia. Hello, Tercia. How the devil are you?
Good evening, John. I am hot, so I think the devil is nearby because it's hot in Worcester.
Okay. But at least you've got electricity, which is an improvement on some occasions.
Yes, and it shouldn't go off anytime soon while we're recording. So nice to see you.
Good, good. And here's our guest. This is Charles Webster. How the devil are you, Charles?
I'm also feeling the heat, John. Maybe hell is real after all.
Well, I keep telling people that they shouldn't believe in Satan because it's our fault if we believe in him.
I hear you. I find demons and things seem to go away when you stop believing in them. So, hey, same page.
Yes. So the reason you're here, Charles, is because I've been trying to lure you in for a couple of years or more. I can't remember when I first cast my hook in your direction, and you resisted being reeled in because you were studying and various other things. So we're going to start by getting you to tell us how you got to be the Charles Webster that you are today, because I know you've had a very interesting journey into and out of Christianity. Will you tell us about that?
Sure, of course. So I guess it makes sense to start with how I got into Christianity first. And basically, I was born into a Christian family. I was born, as it happens, in Argentina. My father had grown up Catholic. My mother was a Protestant, a member of the Reformed Church, one of the three Afrikaans Reformed churches in South Africa, and related to the Dutch Reformed Church, which is probably known as kind of the national party in prayer in the bad old days of apartheid.
Yeah.
I grew up Calvinist, essentially, Reformed, conservative.
Can I quickly ask, Charles, were you in the Gereformeerde Kerk?
Yeah, I was what they call a dopper. So it's kind of...
So was I.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
So was I. Yes.
Right. So we were the English Reformed Church. My mom grew up in the Gereformeerde Kerk in Ladysmith in KZN. And I grew up going to church wearing, I think I wore some safari suits when I was really small. I don't know if you know what those are in England, John, but anyway, horrible.
And jackets.
Yeah.
But not, I guess, the solar topi, because that was more Indian than the Far
Yeah,
East.
no, they're aberrations of culture, really, of fashion, not to be repeated ever.
And your mom had to wear a hat?
I think early on she did. We went to the English Reformed Church, but it was, a lot of the ladies did. So there would be three-piece suits. There'd be the preacher high up on the what do you call it? I've forgotten the word.
Pulpit.
Help me out.
Pulpit.
The pulpit. Thank you. Yes, there we go. And then there'd be the deacons on the right in the front, and the elders on the left, and everybody in rows. And when we'd pray, the men would stand and the women would sit, and we'd sing only psalms, not hymns, because psalms come directly from scripture and hymns are just written by people. And of course, only organs are holy instruments. You can't have stuff like guitars and drums, because I'm not quite sure where it all comes from. But anyway, I would memorize scripture verse by verse every week for Sunday school. I recall memorizing the entire first chapter of the book of John at one point. And yeah, it was very conservative. I grew up actually buying into and being taught the political myth that the Afrikaner nation was somewhat like the nation of the Israelites of the Bible, and there was this sort of siege mentality that the Israelites and the Afrikaners were under siege from the barbarians around them, which of course had massive political over and undertones. And then so that was I'd say for most of primary school. And then in high school, I spent a few years, and that's where I started becoming a church leader in a joint congregational Presbyterian church in Kensington, in Johannesburg. Yes, John.
Can I ask you whether that situation that you've just described still exists in South Africa, or has it gone the way of all flesh?
I mean, the political attitudes definitely still exist. I think the pockets are slightly smaller, and they're increasingly shamed, and rightly so. And they're, but the mentality, is still very much there among too many people. I wouldn't say. I have no research to tell you whether it's a majority or a minority, but I can tell you that I regularly encounter attitudes both in real life and online among white South Africans of various, whether Anglo or Afrikaner, where they still hold these attitudes. And, the part of the country where I live, which is Hilton in the middle of KZN, it's a farming community dominated by things like timber and cattle and sheep, although increasingly we're developing. It's becoming more cosmopolitan, but the attitudes here are, let's just say, I'm grateful as a very outspoken and open atheist that I work remotely for generally multinational clients, and I don't earn my income from this particular community. And it's not that I have anything inherent against this community, but I have friends and fellow musicians, which is another part of me that you can see on the wall behind me here. But musicians, insurance brokers, other people in the community who've come to me because they've seen my statements online and elsewhere and said, gosh, we agree with you, but we can't say anything because if we come out, we'd be sort of cutting our own income streams from under our legs. So that's just an interesting aside there.
But if you wanted to find that sort of church where all the ladies wear hats and the music is played on an organ, you still could?
Oh, yes.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. I mean, and I mean, people sometimes express surprise. I mean, my friends now are all generally, even if they're Christians, they're enlightened and kind of so. But when I say to people, young Earth creationists, some people go to me, no, surely there aren't still people who take the talking snake and the 6 days and the seventh day of rest seriously. I mean, you can't be serious, right? And they disbelieve evolution, and and I have to say to them, actually, if you go out there and engage at all, you very often find this stuff. And it was in the last church I was a member of here in Hilton. There were definitely still young Earth creationists, or they would be, the sort of evolutionary creationists, or they had this sort of hybrid thing where God created the Earth 6,000 years ago with the illusion of age, or that He created it however many billions of years ago, but mankind or humanity only came in 6,000 years ago, and so it's this weird mixture. So then in high school there was the Joint Presbyterian Congregational Church, and then I went to university and I joined a church called the Vineyard, which was famously started by a guy called John Wimber, who was he'd had some involvement with the Righteous Brothers, and he was a musician and there was some sort of link with Unchained Melody. Anyway, the Vineyard was well known for its worship music, and it was more or less the same theologically, although it was a tongues speaking. There were definitely the gifts of the Holy Spirit were a thing.
More
they
Pentecostal.
weren't. Well, so they were sort of muted Pentecostal. They weren't overtly charismatic in the same sense as the Pentecostals, or in South Africa, the New Covenant stream, the Hillsong type of people are quite common. It's a big stream in the churches here. A little bit more reformed and somewhat Calvinist, the Vineyard, but I would say contemporary in style. So you were allowed drums and guitars, and you could have it's wild, I know. So and that's actually that's where I started picking up my guitar again. I'd started classical guitar at 11, and it became a chore. And in church, I started playing guitar and leading worship teams, and I was a home group leader, and I was a home cell leader, and I would lead Bible studies and prayers, and every once in a while I'd be asked to preach, and I considered going into ministry full time. Thank all the gods of all the pantheons that I never did, because I'd probably be a member of the clergy project at this point if I had done that. And I can't imagine it was difficult for me to leave in the end, because I left late in life, as we'll get to. Well, but I can't imagine having to do it as a pastor. It must be excruciating.
Since you mentioned the clergy project, I'd like to flag up that we interviewed a representative of that organization a couple of weeks ago, and people will be able to look in our archive and see that Free Thought Hour.
Fantastic. It's a I'd kind of like to be part of it in a way, just because I think it's a great organization, but I don't really qualify. But I think I've considered recently perhaps looking up the Freedom from Religion folks, because I think they have a South African representation here. And but there's so much to do. John, you and I have spoken somewhat about tertiary studies and things, and I work as a corporate communication consultant. I write for a living. I was a journalist. I studied communication in English and French. I have spoken 5 languages in my life, because my dad was a diplomat. So I was born in Argentina. We lived in Lisbon, then moved back to South Africa. So Spanish, Portuguese, and French. I speak a fair old French at the moment. Afrikaans is fluent, obviously, because of my background, and English is my primary language. I became a journalist at the Star. I covered the elections back in 1994. I had a moment where Tertia will know where Ventersdorp is. It's the headquarters of our local neo-Nazis, the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, where I got myself thrown out of their headquarters at gunpoint on election day in 1994. So that was a little adventure. I was foolhardy. I must have been 20 or 21 at the time. And then I went into journalism, then into tech journalism, and then into corporate communications for tech companies. So I'm a specialist technology writer now, and I won't mention my clients, because that sort of stuff is dangerous to mention. But and in terms of my spiritual journey, I sort of carried on in the vineyard for many years. It was probably, I was a worship leader for at least 20, and in that time I held various other leadership positions. And they called me worship pastor. I was never in the full-time employ of the church. I was never paid to do it. So I don't want to present the impression that I was, but I was deeply involved, to the point where, it would sometimes be a minority of evenings in a week where I wasn't at some sort of church function. It would be a home cell, and then there'd be a worship team practice, and then there'd be, Sunday mornings, when I think of all the hours I wasted waking up at 6 o'clock, the one church I was in, I'd have to go and drive to my pastor's house to fetch a trailer, because we didn't have a building, to load up the sound gear, to take it to church, to unpack it, to set up the PA system, to warm up, to then lead worship, and then do all of that in reverse at the end. And it'd be like 6 o'clock to 12, like 6 hours a Sunday, every Sunday. Well, most Sundays, because it was a small congregation.
Has that left you with a grievance, that you spent so much of the early part of your life pursuing this, which you have subsequently refuted?
Yes, it has, John. I do resent it somewhat. And that resentment has, I guess, toned down over the years, and one becomes more pragmatic about it. And you also become more forgiving of yourself, I suppose, because I look at myself now, and I think, how did I believe that stuff? And I realize, and other people tell me, and it's important to process these things with other people, but how very inculcated and I don't want to use too many philosophical terms here. So, but the epistemology, the whole foundation of knowledge, the basis on which we know that we know something. When you grow up in an environment like that, that whole basis is distorted. And what I mean by that is that people tell you that you can know things with certainty when you actually can't. And very often those people themselves have not done the basics of studying what it means, what knowledge is, and what it means to know something, and how evidence and reason work, and they don't even know the basics of a fallacy. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, sorry, Tertia, I'll make space for you in a minute, but because you mentioned certainty and that you can't know things with certainty, I'd like to slightly disagree with you there, because there is one group of things that you can know with certainty, and those are the things that are wrong.
Well, yeah. I suppose there's always a counterfactual, and it would make for an interesting discussion. I don't believe. The studies I referred to, the tertiary studies and the postgrad studies, were in philosophy, and I don't know that I believe in truth with a capital T. I think that generally it's a red herring for me, and it's one that theists often use, because they'll say, well, you can't know anything for certain either. You can't even prove that you're not a brain in a bowl or whatever. And for me, that's not a requirement for knowledge. It's not a requirement to know with certainty. You have to know reasonably and reliably and usefully.
We could go down this rabbit hole and discuss what truth is, but Tertia, you have a go.
I will not go into the truth rabbit hole or not, but I am also a proponent of the idea that I don't think there's such a thing as truth with a capital T, simply because we might always find new information. But I do feel that there are degrees of certainty, and that we often fall into the trap of thinking that we are more certain than we should reasonably be of things. But something about the whole thing about that indoctrination, and not what makes the type of religion that you and I grew up in, Charles, I can identify with what you're saying to such a great extent, is that the moment you question, the moment you doubt, then you have to feel guilty. And that almost makes it a foolproof system, because it's not only that you're not supposed to ask questions, it's that it's really dangerous to ask questions. And you keep it mostly to yourself because of that fear, and because of the guilt is so deeply inculcated, because doubt is almost the ultimate sin, So it's very difficult to get out of that mindset. I listened to Forrest Valkai. You might be familiar with him. I follow him on YouTube. And he said something the other day. He grew up sort of quasi-religious, but not in any particular sect like you and I did. And he said that when he speaks to people who became free of religious indoctrination, he thinks of people like you and me, Charles, as brave. And I never thought of it like that. And it actually is a very courageous thing to do, to examine your own beliefs and then to walk away, because it entails walking away from community. It might entail walking away from income, job opportunities. The price one pays is not only emotional; it's sometimes really very tangible in terms of materialistic things. So I just wanted to get into that guilt thing that we had to deal with constantly. I don't know if you experience it like that.
Well, they talk about Catholic guilt, and that was like, but I have to say, the whole Reformed Church feeling. So it's based on this idea of salvation by grace, not by works, and that absolutely nothing you can do. I once sat in a sermon, and this is etched into my brain. It's like someone took a soldering iron and seared it into my gray matter. And this minister was saying, what we have to do is take all of our bad works and throw them on a heap. And then we have to take all of our good works and throw them onto another heap and run away as far away from both as possible. And that there's this whole idea that we're really these worms, that we are these abject and and useless, and that nothing we can do is good enough. And that's why we need this this atoning, say the substitutionary atonement thing, to get us out of the original sin, because there's just nothing we can do. So that guilt thing I strongly identify with. And I guess, at the age of 35, I started having real, just the internal dialogue started taking over, and I said to myself, and I said to other people, that truth matters to me, and that's kind of what kicked the whole journey off for me. So I was leading worship in the church here in Hilton, and I would lead worship, and the sermon would start afterwards. And often I'd find myself walking out of the church and just going and walking around the fields of the school where the meetings would happen, and trying to process the turmoil inside. And I started looking at some of the doctrine and the little things. I always visualize it. Maybe this will help people understand my journey, but I present it as a tree, and the leaves and the outer buds and the tiny branches are like the small doctrinal things, like what I said earlier, we only sing psalms and not hymns or whatever. And as the branches get thicker, you get into, do you baptize by full immersion, or do you sprinkle water? And then you get to, should you be Muslim or Hindu or Christian? And then the main trunk of the tree is a God, whichever, some God. And then the roots and the ground are the what I'd call the epistemological basis, the evidence and the reason that people apply to demonstrate, or at least so they think, the existence of the God, and to obviously feed that whole superstructure. And I'd been messing around in the branches and the leaves and the buds, and I got to a point where I just realized I was kind of wasting my time, because in philosophy we talk about contingencies, and I realized that everything was dependent on that main trunk. If there's no God, it really is irrelevant and immaterial whether I'm a Muslim or whether I sprinkle or baptize by full immersion. And so I decided, in that period between the time I was 35 and 40, and I turned 40 in 2013. So I'm 50 this year, and I decided that I was going to go and investigate my faith and prove to myself and to others that a God exists. Yes, John.
I see a parallel here. Torsia, your story is very similar.
Very similar. It's funny because even in terms of age, when's your birthday, Charles?
It's the winter solstice, the 21st of June here.
Okay, so I'm about 6 months older than you, and it was also around about my 40s that I started to examine, and I turned 50 a week ago. So,
congrats!
Thank you. I see the parallels are just amazing, and what I find interesting is that I was always under the impression that the Reformed, gereformeerde kerk, the dopper thing, was very much Afrikaans. I wasn't aware to what extent it was also prevalent in English communities. So, yeah,
Look, in fairness, you probably would never have encountered me or us. I think there were, from what I understood, there were 2 or 3 in the entire country. And generally, so our preacher, who was a lovely guy, and I have to say here, in principle, I have friends who are theists, and I'll have a beer with anybody, and I care much more about whether you're an ethical person and a decent person than whether you believe exactly like I do. So, and at the same time, I am anti-theist. But he was a lovely guy, and he was not one of those cynical pastors or ministers in this case. He wasn't the mega church type, and there are many people like that who are well-intentioned. And he came from the Free Church of Scotland, because the English Reformed Church is so small that there wasn't really a pool of people to draw from, and obviously we were English, so most of the Afrikaans ministers came from Afrikaans universities and spoke Afrikaans and couldn't come and speak to us. But You know, I was kind of, as I was preparing, sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here because I want to dispel the idea that atheists dislike Christians for being Christian, you know, and that we are hateful people and you know, that we're immoral and purposeless and all that nonsense. Because we've interviewed several Christians on here, and they're lovely people, some of them, you know. So there's no reason to make everything about the label. Look deeper, find out what a person is really like.
And conversely, I've encountered so many, you know, atheists and secularists who are utter jerks. You know, so just for the record, you know, whoever's out there listening. But I think I can sum up the reason, you know, in your blurb, John, the one you put out about this interview, you sort of asked the question why, or what happened to Charles, and I can sum it up in one sentence. Truth matters, and I can see no rational path to a belief in God that retains any sense of what truth and knowledge mean in any meaningful sense. I can't see an intellectually honest path to a belief in God if you go to the root of how logic and reason and evidence work. And so I, you know, when people ask me why I'm an atheist or what I like most about it, the greatest freedom of all for me is that if you ask me a question, I will answer you with what I think and what I can reasonably know to the best of my knowledge using the reason and evidence at my disposal. And I got so completely sick of having to edit answers to questions, and really important questions of life, so that they wouldn't contradict my theology.
Yes, well, that's all anybody can do, is give their opinion, really. But I wanted to probe a little deeper here, because you've indicated that there were what you might call the leaves, the trivial things that started to make you doubt and have this conflict in your head. There was no single crushing blow that turned you from Christ to atheist?
I mean, I have yet to encounter I guess it exists in the form of someone perhaps losing a loved one and going, you know, what kind of monstrous God allows, you know, X. So I get that. But even with those people, I generally find that there are accompanying issues that sort of complement that. I had no single issue. And I will say, this is probably the thing that freaks theists out the most when they speak to me, I suppose, and others like me, is they can understand the thing of, I lost my wife or I lost my child, and so I can't believe in a God. But when they hear that someone has gone and thoughtfully investigated their faith and systematically gone to study what it means to know and to understand and to base opinions and thoughts and knowledge on reason, and then after 3 or 4 or 5 years to slowly and carefully and thoughtfully walk away from everything you've known and everything you hold dear, and in the process lose almost all your friends, you know, suffer pretty significant social rejection, among other things that I won't really go into for personal reasons, but there were some pretty devastating things in my personal life that occurred as a result. And you still choose to go through with that. I don't think that they can, you know, my former pastor, actually, I played in a band with him, and he just called me stupid outright. And someone else I was playing music with in the church and doing gigs outside of that said, you know, he had to decide whether he could still make music with an atheist. And I know those statements, they came out of some sense of, I suppose, threat, because I find that theists often feel threatened just by my presence, even though I say nothing. If they find out I don't believe, they seem to think that by definition I think they're stupid or somehow inferior, and it's just not the case. But they seem to get a sense of threat, and it was quite a process.
Charles, I want to ask you about the process. What role did the Bible play? the Bible itself and reading the Bible in your deconversion. And I want to refer back, John, when we last spoke to who was one of our previous guests? The name's left my the apologist.
The pastor in High Wycombe. I know who you mean, but I can't think of his name either.
Yes, but there was also that apologist, Ronald Cram.
Oh, Ronald. Yes, that was a
Yes,
couple of
when
weeks.
Ronald was on. So something that if I have to name one thing that led to my deconversion, it was reading the Bible. Reading the Bible without my God glasses, just reading the Bible. Because as you know, in the tradition that you and I come from, Charles, scripture is extremely important. And I also have a background in literature, and I wanted to become a journalist, but I ended up doing English literature as my main field of study. So texts and how text work and the interaction between texts and readers and texts has always fascinated me. And once I started to apply that knowledge that I gained through years of study to the Bible, which I never did before, it became clear to me that the Bible cannot be the word of God, because if the Bible is the word of God and God is perfect and flawless, then he couldn't have authored the Bible, because the messages in the Bible are so conflicted. And I'm not even talking about discrepancies in terms of information. I'm just talking about what is the message. And it was interesting. Ronald said, I made the statement in that podcast that if I create a message and two people interpret my message in completely opposite ways, then my message is flawed and I am a flawed communicator.
Mm.
And Ronald was very vehement that that is not the case, that the fault is with the reader. And you being a communications expert, what would you say to that comment that about the Bible, and that the onus of conveying a clear message, an unambiguous message, is on the creator of the message?
I mean, look, I've studied communication, and in the sender-receiver model, there is clear responsibility on both sides. So in a standard piece of communication, you expect a sender to write as clearly and as lucidly as possible, and you expect a reader to read with clarity, and a reader should look for what is plausibly and charitably the most likely intent on the part of the sender. However, you are talking here about the alleged creator of the universe, the all-powerful, omniscient, seeing all ends, presumably fairly literate God of the universe. And when you're communicating about the single most important issue apparently in the universe, the existence of God, the need not to go to hell, and apparently this God is desperate for relationship with us, wants to hold us to his bosom, and to go walk with us in the garden again, and to reunite and reestablish the relationship that was severed in the Garden of Eden. And I have to say that with all due respect to Mr. Cram or Minister Cram or Reverend Cram, it sounds like nonsense to me. To just, I can understand that. So there is a responsibility in any piece of text for readers to read it accurately, and that applies to the Bible as it does to any book. When you've got these major groups, you've got people who justify racism on the basis of the Bible, people who justify, homophobia. So
I'm very much on the side of the writer needs to make his intentions clear. I mean, take, for example, an instruction manual on how to repair your car. It's got to be crystal clear. Yeah.
No, I agree, John. I mean, I say this for the sake of balance. I'm talking about in a general objective sense. There is responsibility on a reader as well. But, so Tertia, to answer your question, there is stuff there, because for me, one of the major things, and I approached this pastor who I'd spoken about, who was in the band with me, I asked him once about whether God changed, because there are definite changes between Old Testament rules and New Testament rules, and of course the whole change in the covenants thing comes in. So that's been done to death, but for me there was really no way around it. If it's okay to own slaves, or if it's okay to command the stoning of a non-virgin bride, you can't. There was never a time when it was okay to stone a young woman for apparently not being a virgin, which is scientific nonsense anyway. You can't test for that. We all know this. So any God that would command that or allow it or in any way condone it is just monstrous. And you can't, and apparently that's wrong. If you ask any Christian with any ethics, and this is just my point, is that we all get our ethics from the same place ultimately. They just happen to read their ethics into the Bible like a Rorschach test, where we're just saying, well, there's good reason, whether it's utilitarian or Kantian or whatever it is, that we just look at ethics in terms of consequences and whatever, and we figure out what's right and wrong. They happen to have largely the same values most of the time, yes, but they find a reason to find it in the Bible. Yes. And I couldn't get past this thing that God is supposed to be unchanging, and yet he seemed to be changing the rules. And either it's okay for those things to happen, or it's not, or God is changing, not unchanging. And it is to me, it seems like a true dichotomy. The other thing, and this is something that we should probably chat about, but I grew up homophobic, essentially. I grew up, my parents had some gay friends, and one of them was in one of the other churches, Tertia, the Dutch Reformed Church, and he was a gay man, and he committed suicide because he couldn't reconcile his identity with his beliefs. And there was another gay friend who, it was either in Portugal or in Argentina, but we've visited there only once. And when I asked my parents why we hadn't seen more of this person, there was this implied thing that it was either going to somehow rub off on me, or that gay men were somehow inherently evil and could perhaps, I guess, fiddle with me or something. And my wife grew up in a charismatic church as well. And she never had these values. She wasn't homophobic. And her best friend growing up is a gay man. And he at one point asked her to be his maid of honor at his wedding. And I, being at that stage still, and I have to say, along with my homophobia came, sexism and other things. And I'm now a raging feminist, although I still have to fight some of the stuff that I've grown up with. But I said to her, no, we can't do that. We can't condone a gay marriage. But it started to seep through, the pain that I was causing. This is the person my wife was closest to growing up. And my wife is the person who's closest to me, whom I love. And I'm preventing her from being at the most important event of this person's life.
Yes.
And it became a real personal journey for me, to the extent that in the end, in 2015, I went back to university in my 40s, and I did honors and then master's degrees in philosophy. And the topic of my master's dissertation was how we should respond legally and socially to biblically based homophobic hate speech. And because it was something that I wanted to work through myself and look at precedent, and I wanted to write something that could be used. I submitted it to one of our parliamentary subcommittees at one point. I've sent it to various places and various people, and I sometimes do public speaking engagements, and I've done things on misogyny and gender-based violence, and another one I've done. I did it to a trans rights organization, for a trans rights organization that I've subsequently become involved in. But I called it the recovering homophobe, and I described my journey of how it's a real journey of self-discovery and pain, and the pain that I caused others, and understanding how much I had to change. And it's why there are a few things that get me really riled. I generally I try to remain calm, but when people accuse me of bad faith in my reasoning, unless they are really honest and accurate and in good faith, I can get quite angry about it internally quite quickly, because you can pretty much name every social, every moral, every ethical issue, every issue of belief, whether it's a God belief, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, abortion, the death penalty. I've taken every single one of these things, and I've either reversed them completely or changed them radically. And I don't claim some sort of special status, but it's really important to me, and I get quite passionate about it. So anyway, when people accuse me of being in bad faith about that, about my intent, I'm perfectly capable of making mistakes and committing errors of reasoning and judgment, and I have my biases like everyone else. But don't tell me I've got bad intent unless you really know me, because I've done some work.
And that's the most important thing. What a person intends, how they react, how they behave. Much more important than other people's opinions of them, other people's labels for them. What you've just done is you've gone through a litany of all the various sorts of religious harm that's still being perpetrated in the world today. Misogyny, homophobia, hatred for no reason, and divisions that it causes between friends needlessly, all that sort of stuff. So you touched on how you have been, I'm not going to use the word suffer, how you have been hindered yourself by the reaction of other people to your atheism now. Can you say a bit more about that? Are you still in friends with your parents, for example?
My father passed away last year from COVID, so but he was still very much a theist. He hadn't really investigated it in the way that I have. The only thing, he was the sort of man who tended to avoid things rather than confronting them. And it's a little bit of a family trait, I'll say, in all honesty, with a little bit of self-disclosure there. But the one thing I did hear him say at one point was that he was sick of having to apologize for what he believed. And it's odd, because that wasn't something I ever expected of him. I think, again, it's probably a function of the nature of our relationship, number one, and number two, just my forthrightness. And I think he felt, I don't know, he certainly seemed to suppress his responses. When the subject would come up, he wouldn't say much. I think he realized that I had gone a fair way down pretty much every track there is, because I wanted my faith to be true, John. It would have been far easier for me to stay in the church. And this is a key thing that people don't realize. I didn't want to lose my friends. I didn't want to lose my faith. My faith was important to me. It was the foundation. It was my whole, existential infrastructure. And to throw that away is kind of, it really is comparable to coming out as gay, or as, you suddenly aren't in the box that people expect you to be in anymore. And there's just a lot that goes with that. So he didn't ever really talk about it, but that was pretty much the nature of our relationship. It wasn't very close in the end. My mom is still around. She's still very much the same Reformed Church person, as far as I understand, that I grew up with. And it's an interesting relationship. It's difficult at times, but we, to be honest, we don't really speak. And that's my choice. But for example, I would find that she would be quite judgmental about certain kinds of music, or she'd make judgments about the way people dress, or very conservative, typical kinds of values. And I don't know, it'd be interesting if she ever hears this. It's out there now, but sadly, my relationship with my parents, for reasons including some of the religious stuff, but for other extraneous reasons as well, had kind of deteriorated over the years to the point where the last few years I haven't really had contact with either of them.
Yeah, but you've repaired your relationship with your wife and your children, who are now at university, college. How have they been brought up? Have they gone under a journey, or did they never get inducted, or what happened?
No,
I'd like to
that's
hear that part.
So here's another piece of self-disclosure. I also grew up under a fairly strong regimen of corporal punishment. And I remember getting hidings from the age of 5 onwards. And it was a thing that I grew up thinking was normal. And so initially, I brought them up religious. They were in their sort of tweens, early teens. I think our youngest was not yet a teenager. And they cried. They thought Dad was going to hell. And I just had to be sort of calm and gentle and try to reassure them and let them. It was kind of a hands-off approach where I would just answer questions, and I would just ask inquiring questions if they raised something and let them draw their own conclusions. It was very tricky because I felt it was unfair of me to become that sort of aggressively controlling parent, to try and steer them directly or into my way of thinking, because I'd raised them in a certain way to that point. And if you think of, I'm not a childhood development expert of any sort, so I don't want to pretend that I am, but I can't imagine. It must be a lot like gaslighting if you suddenly try to do that, or their minds, their brains aren't developed. They're very emotionally tied. So I would just answer questions, and I would just share with them my journey and say, this is what troubles me. This is what I don't understand. This is what I, and subsequent to that, they've sometimes just said to me, Dad, we just listen, and what you said, we love talking to you, and we can ask you things, and it just sort of made sense. And they just slowly, it just kind of slowly seeped out of them when the I guess the valve was opened. They just had the freedom to explore ideas in a way that I hadn't at their age. And when there isn't that pressure to maintain, and you're not, because this is why they say you have to go to church, you must be at prayer meeting, you must read your Bible, because you're constantly shoring up that bad epistemology, those bad reasons for belief. It's like fingers in the dike, and you take out a few, and it just, water starts to leak out. It's almost inevitable. And I would say, with respect to all the theists out there, when I decided that truth mattered to me, and once I'd started actually investigating how knowledge and truth work, the outcome of my journey was inevitable. But my kids now, none of them are believers anymore. All 3 of them. My eldest is 25. She's just finishing off a degree in international relations. Rebecca, our middle child's doing fine arts honors, and Michael, our youngest, is also doing fine arts. And they're all free of the matrix, I'm happy to say.
I'm pleased to hear that the enlightened parenting you've described, but this is a strange thing about a religion, particularly Christianity. It was such a powerful tool of colonization because it's self-perpetuating. Everyone you've converted feels they have to convert everyone else. Particularly their children, they have to assert, be authoritative, punishing. It's all part of the same parcel.
Yeah, you're right. And I think this is where that false equivalence comes from, where people accuse folks like, both of you and me of being, evangelical atheists or born again atheists, or of, because, and what they don't understand is that we're responding to it. There's this real sense in which you're obliged, right? The Great Commission says, go out and make disciples, and you have to say that any ethical person, let's assume for the sake of argument that Christianity is true in the conservative traditional sense, and there's a hell and people are going to that place of eternal conscious torture, you would be immoral not to try to save them from that, right? It would be unconscionable if it were the case. Of course, I have no reason to think it is, but in that context, it does self-perpetuate, and it's the old. I think it was Ricky Gervais who remarked that it's funny how people say you should keep your atheism to yourself and walk around with their funny hats and their crucifixes and whatever. It's this double standard, and I always compare it to putting out a fire. It's not the same as being an arsonist. There is a harm being perpetuated here, and I don't go knocking on people's doors. I don't go saying, "Hey, can I tell you about the great void?" There's a proactive thing there, and of course, I don't have to tell you folks about how it seeps into legislation and even societal attitudes, and how that's an old story. So
can I quickly come in here, because, and John, at the risk of making the show too South African, but I think it's important for our international viewers to what the situation in the UK, for example, and in many other European countries is very different from what it is in a country like South Africa. And I think people in Muslim countries will experience the same. Although in South Africa, we're definitely not persecuted for being non-religious. But I want to ask Charles if he experienced the same type of thing. So when I deconverted, we just relocated to a fairly small town in the Western Cape. And regarding my kids, they found it very difficult to have a mother and father who were not like all the other parents. And it caused quite a bit of friction in our family, because teenagers want to fit in, and some teenagers need to fit in more than others do. There's so many elements. It's personality, and it's family dynamics. And there were times when we had severe conflict in my family, my children and I in particular, because I've always been a more outspoken personality than my husband. So though he's also non-religious, he is very good at just sort of avoiding the topic, where I'm the type of person, when I meet somebody and they say, "Oh, God just blessed us with your presence," or something, the way that I don't respond says more than any response. I'm just one of those people. So did you find that the fact that you were non-religious had sort of an impact on how you operated in your children's school, for example, and that type of thing?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, the children's school is an extremely religious one, and I will say there have been different leaders at the school now, and there's a headmaster there now who is really an enlightened Christian and is not homophobic and is not, but that until very recently was not the case. So where for a number of years, for example, I'd played music at school events, or that kind of thing. I will say, Tertia, I'm not sure I agree. I mean, I think we are persecuted, perhaps not legally, perhaps not in terms of legislation, but for me, persecution includes things like, like I was told, that I'm a child of the devil, and and people have said that our marriage is no longer legitimate because I'm not a believer, and people have so.
Something I can, sorry, I'm interrupting you, Charles, but I want to say I have a friend he's non-religious. He's a photographer. He's a professional photographer and videographer. And he had a contract to take all the school pictures at a particular school. And they went and looked on his personal Facebook profile, where he's fairly openly non-religious. And they actually phoned him and said, "Sorry, we are going to cancel the contract with you. Because we don't want a non-religious photographer."
Yeah.
I mean, it costs a lot of money, and that's definitely persecution, in my opinion.
No, agreed. So what I find, and I actually went, I find that people, when they meet me, they get to know me. And it's a little bit like if you're a homophobe and you get to know a gay person, it demystifies that whole thing. And you realize this is another human being who loves someone who has needs and desires and just wants to live their life in peace. You might find this interesting. I went to an Alpha course a while ago.
Yeah.
I got invited, and this was like maybe 3 years ago. It was just before, just before COVID. And I went along, and I was somewhat tongue in cheek, I'll confess. But I thought, hey, I'll go along, and hey, maybe I've missed something. Come on, guys, bring it on. Tell me what I've missed. It's a kind of a shrink wrapped video presentation thing that's just full of logical holes and holes in reasoning. It's actually really poor. I was really disappointed. I'd expected something more, I don't know, adult. But anyway, the more interesting thing is I didn't deconvert anybody. I didn't really go there to deconvert anybody. But what I regarded as a success was that at the end of this process, and John, I think I wrote an article for you a few years back.
Yes, you did.
Under the auspices of another organization. And one of the lady at the table who was perhaps the most vociferous said to me, gosh, actually, you're such a nice guy. And, I'm always tempted, I often say with my tongue in my cheek, hey, so-and-so is a Christian, but they're really a nice person. Because it's like, what kind of assumption is that?
Yes.
But I regarded it as a victory to just go there and present a face of just a human being who happens not to believe and happens to be hopefully fairly personable and friendly and just normal. And they said to me, we're just so surprised you came here and you're so nice. And they actually they really wanted me to be there because I think they found it really interesting. The questions I was throwing. The one guy said to me, but my cell phone broke and I prayed for it and then it started working again. And there must be something to that, correlation, causation, fallacy, whatever. But it was some really funny stuff too. But there were just people there. We had muffins and coffee and we talked about stuff. And that was the victory for me. The victory is we live in this world, and in South Africa, Tertia's right. We've got about an 80% Christian population in South Africa of one sort or another. And you can debate the depth of it, but we have to exist in this place. And for me, destigmatizing, normalizing the state of being a non-believer as being just another state of humanity is vital for us to exist in a world with relative calm and being able to have some kind of existential peace. And I'll say generally, it's difficult at this point in South Africa to have that kind of existential peace, and in any kind of conservatively religious majority country.
Yeah. Well, go around showing people that you're not a demon. And hopefully that's mostly what we need to do. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our show. And we've had such fun talking, but time goes by. All that's left for me to do is to announce that next week we've got another interesting guest who is a French Canadian by the name of Ray Villeneuve, and he will be turning the tables on Tercia and I because he wants to pick our brains. That'll be fun.
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it very much. But Charles, I think you and I must make some separate get-together, perhaps in Afrikaans, with maybe Dean Kruger, who I think is listening, who's in the show, to do something for the I'm a very strong believer in that any non-religious, especially Afrikaans-speaking person in South Africa, should be out to destigmatize being non-religious in the Afrikaans, Afrikaans, English, South African communities. So, Charles, if I pop you a mail, please, let's see what we can do. I mean, you can always come and do a gig down in Cape Town and we can get together. It's so nice to speak to a fellow South African. John, you're welcome to join us. The
Well,
weather's
I'm feeling a bit left out now because I'd like to join in.
Well, John, can I just say, thank you so much again for having me. It's been a real joy to be on, and I'd love to do it again sometime. And it would be actually great to be on with a theist sometime. But happy to do that, Tertia, and thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Good.
We'll get together, work. Charles. I'll track you down in Hilton. And John, you know that you have a standing invitation. There's always a bed for you in the parsonage here in Worcester, South Africa. And John put my son and myself up. He gave us 2 nights in his house. It was lovely to meet John and his family. And we don't just eat babies and scream and shout. We actually we like one another, and we like most people in general until they prove themselves to be not nice, whether they're religious, non-religious, atheist, or theist. So on that note, I'm going to shut my mouth and say goodbye, everybody.
Charles, do you video your performances like Sweet Caroline, for example? Do you?
Yeah, I mean, so people can find me on, if you're on Facebook, there are a few places. So Charles Webster Music is my personal Facebook music page. Then the show that I do, the Neil Diamond Show, the page is called Diamond is Forever. And in fact, there's about a 1.5-minute video clip of exactly that song at our local watering hole called Crossways here in Hilton with the crowd. It was a lovely evening. We had about 100 people there, something like 120 people, all singing Sweet Caroline at the end of the show.
Oh, nice.
And of course, anyone who's watching is welcome to send me a friend request on Facebook. It's Charles Webster. I think there's a picture of me sipping a gin and tonic in a leather cowboy-looking hat at the moment is my profile pic if you're looking for me. So
that's right. That's the one I use for the poster. Yes. So Charles Webster Music. That's the site to go to see Charles performing. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and we've had quite a lot of people giving us comments. I've screened some of them, and some I've not screened because they were talking amongst themselves rather than talking to us. But thank you for watching, you guys, and thank you all the future people who will see us as a podcast. Here we go with Charles's outro. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.